In the late hours of Washington, D.C., when the city's grand monument stood silent and marble-white under the glow of streetlights, another Washington existed just beyond the reach of postcards and political speeches. This was a Washington of back stairwells, dimly lit apartment hallways, and corners where conversations were brief and guarded. It was a city where power did not always announce itself with speeches or motorcades. Sometimes, power moved quietly, carried in envelopes, whispered over payphones, and enforced without spectacle. In this shadowed world, a name began to circulate, not loudly, not publicly, but persistently. Rayful Edmond III. To most residents, he was invisible. To those who understood the streets, he was everywhere. The story begins not with sirens or gunfire, but with absence. An absence of a single face to blame for the chaos unfolding across neighborhoods. Crack cocaine had begun to seep into Washington like a slow, corrosive tide, altering daily life in ways that felt sudden yet inevitable. Families noticed it first in small changes, stores closing earlier, unfamiliar faces lingering too long, arguments erupting where laughter once lived. The newspapers spoke of a drug epidemic, of violence, of a city under siege. But behind the headlines, there was a deeper mystery. Who was supplying it all? Who controlled the flow so efficiently that entire sections of the city seemed transformed almost overnight? Law enforcement chased ghosts. Arrests were made daily, yet the source remained untouched. Street-level dealers fell, replaced almost immediately by others, as if drawn from an endless supply. Rumors circulated about a young man who never sold drugs himself, who rarely appeared in public, who trusted no one fully yet commanded absolute loyalty. Unlike the flamboyant gangsters of New York or Miami, there were no photographs splashed across tabloids, no flashy trials, no nicknames shouted by the press. Rayful Edmond III ruled without spectacle, and that made him far more dangerous. To understand why his rise mattered, one must slow down and listen to the rhythm of the city at that time. Washington in the late 1980s was a place of sharp contrasts. By day, it was the seat of American democracy, filled with lawmakers debating policy beneath ornate ceilings. By night, vast portions of the city felt forgotten, cut off from opportunity and stability. The divide was not subtle. It was etched into housing projects, school systems, and job prospects. Into this environment stepped a generation that learned early how to navigate scarcity. Some sought legitimate paths out. Others, seeing the limits placed before them, turned inward, toward economies that thrived precisely because they were forbidden. Rayful Edmond III did not announce his ambition. There was no single moment where he declared an intention to rule Washington's drug trade. Instead, his rise was incremental, calculated, and patient. Those who encountered him in his early years often described him as calm, observant, almost unremarkable. He listened more than he spoke. He noticed patterns others ignored. In a world where many chased fast money and fast recognition, Edmond understood something fundamental: visibility invited danger. Silence, on the other hand, allowed power to grow undisturbed. As crack cocaine reshaped urban America, Edmond positioned himself not as a reckless pioneer, but as a careful architect. While others fought openly for territory, he built networks. While rivals drew attention with violence, he enforced discipline quietly. This approach created an aura that was difficult to define. People knew his name, yet few could describe his face. They felt his influence in the consistency of supply, in the order maintained within chaos, and in the unspoken rules that governed certain streets. To cross those rules was unwise. To speak his name too freely was worse. What made Edmond's story especially unsettling was how ordinary it appeared on the surface. He was not born into legendary criminal lineage. He did not arrive from another city with an army at his back. He was a product of Washington itself, shaped by its contradictions and failures. This familiarity allowed him to blend in seamlessly. Neighbors might pass him without a second glance, unaware that the quiet figure before them commanded an empire worth millions. That invisibility was not accidental. It was his greatest defense. As the city's crack crisis deepened, the consequences became impossible to ignore. Emergency rooms overflowed. Crime statistics climbed. Entire communities felt trapped in a cycle of addiction and fear. Politicians promised action. Police departments expanded task forces. Yet the central figure behind much of the devastation remained untouched, operating with a precision that baffled investigators. Every trail seemed to end just short of him, as though the city itself conspired to keep him hidden. For listeners drifting into sleep, there is something eerily calming about the way this story unfolds. Not because of the suffering involved, but because of its slow inevitability. Edmond's rise was not explosive, it was steady, almost methodical. Each decision led naturally to the next, each success reinforcing his belief in staying unseen. Power, in his world, was not about dominance through fear alone. It was about control through predictability. People knew what to expect from his organization, and that consistency bred compliance. Yet even as his influence expanded, the seeds of downfall were quietly being planted. No system, no matter how disciplined, exists in isolation. Every network depends on people, and people bring unpredictability with them: greed, fear, ambition, regret. The very scale that made Edmond powerful also made him vulnerable, though that vulnerability would take years to surface. At this early stage, however, he seemed untouchable, an unseen force shaping the fate of a city while remaining comfortably beyond reach. This opening chapter is not about glorifying crime, nor about reveling in notoriety. It is about understanding how quietly power can grow when conditions allow it, and how entire communities can be affected by someone they never truly see. Rayful Edmond III did not announce himself as a king, but Washington felt his rule all the same. His story invites a deeper question, one that lingers gently in the mind as the night grows quieter: how many other empires exist just beyond our awareness, shaping lives in silence, waiting for the moment when invisibility finally fails? As the city slept, his operation continued, humming softly beneath the surface. And while few knew it then, the invisible king had already reached the height of his power. What followed would take years to unfold, slowly and relentlessly, proving that even the most carefully hidden figures cannot remain unseen forever. Before the name Rayful Edmond III ever carried weight on the streets, Washington, D.C., itself was already drifting toward a quiet breaking point. Long before the crack epidemic dominated headlines, the city lived with deep, slow-moving fractures that shaped everyday life. These fractures were not sudden disasters but gradual erosions: economic neglect, social division, and the steady disappearance of opportunity in neighborhoods far removed from the polished corridors of federal power. To understand how an underground empire could take root so effectively, it is necessary to linger in this earlier Washington, when the storm had not yet arrived but the air already felt heavy. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Washington was a city of contrasts sharper than in most American places. Downtown, government buildings glowed with authority and permanence, symbols of stability meant to project confidence to the world. Just a few miles away, entire communities lived with uncertainty that felt permanent in a very different way. Factories that once provided stable employment had closed or relocated. Manufacturing jobs disappeared quietly, leaving behind empty buildings and broken routines. For many families, work became irregular, temporary, or simply unavailable. The loss of income was not just financial, it stripped away structure, purpose, and hope. Housing projects rose as solutions but often became symbols of abandonment. Poor maintenance, overcrowding, and isolation turned them into environments where survival required constant alertness. Children grew up learning which stairwells to avoid, which streets felt safe at certain hours, and which faces belonged to authority and which belonged to threat. Schools struggled with limited resources, overcrowded classrooms, and students carrying the weight of instability from home. Education, often described as the way out, felt distant and unreliable for many who needed it most. At the same time, Washington's unique political status created another layer of frustration. Residents lived in the shadow of national decision-making yet had limited control over their own city's future. Policies were debated in buildings that towered over neighborhoods where the consequences of those policies were felt most sharply. This disconnect fostered a quiet resentment, a sense that the city's most vulnerable communities were visible only when problems became impossible to ignore. Until then, neglect felt routine. In this environment, informal economies flourished. They were not always criminal at first. People sold food, fixed cars, watched children, and found creative ways to survive outside formal systems that seemed uninterested in them. Over time, however, these informal networks became pathways for more dangerous trades. When legitimate work failed to meet basic needs, illegal markets offered what looked like opportunity, fast money, status, and a sense of control otherwise absent from daily life. Heroin had already scarred parts of Washington by the 1970s, leaving behind addiction and distrust. By the early 1980s, cocaine entered the picture more prominently, first as a drug associated with wealth and exclusivity. It moved through nightclubs and private circles, far removed from public housing and street corners. But chemistry, economics, and human behavior soon transformed it. Crack cocaine emerged as a cheaper, more accessible form, and with it came a shift that would change the city permanently. What had once been distant suddenly arrived at doorsteps. Before crack fully took hold, there was a brief, uneasy pause, a moment when the city stood on the edge without fully realizing it. Police departments knew drugs were a problem, but resources were spread thin. Political leaders debated approaches while communities lived the consequences. Families sensed something changing, even if they could not yet name it. There was an increase in petty crime, more unfamiliar faces passing through, more tension in places once defined by routine. The storm clouds gathered slowly, unnoticed by those focused elsewhere. This was the Washington into which young men like Rayful Edmond III matured. They did not grow up dreaming of destroying their city. They grew up observing its failures. They saw how quickly legitimate paths closed and how unevenly opportunity was distributed. They watched who had power and who did not, learning early that power did not always belong to those who followed the rules. In such an environment, adaptability became a form of intelligence. Survival demanded awareness, patience, and the ability to read systems, both official and unofficial. The streets themselves taught lessons that classrooms could not. Silence was valued. Attention could be dangerous. Trust was rare and often conditional. Those who thrived learned to move carefully, to speak little, and to observe constantly. Violence existed, but it was not always the primary currency. Reputation, reliability, and access mattered just as much. These were the unspoken rules of a city learning to live with instability. As crack cocaine began to circulate more widely, it did not feel like an invasion so much as an escalation. The infrastructure for underground trade already existed. Distribution routes, neighborhood networks, and informal hierarchies were in place, waiting to be exploited. What crack introduced was scale, an intensity and profitability that transformed small operations into massive enterprises almost overnight. The city was unprepared for how quickly this transformation would occur, and by the time its effects were undeniable, the foundations were already deeply set. From the outside, Washington's struggles were often reduced to statistics, crime rates, overdose numbers, arrest totals. Inside the neighborhoods, however, the experience was deeply personal. Parents worried about children navigating streets where temptation and danger were constant. Elders watched familiar faces disappear into addiction or incarceration. A sense of mourning settled in quietly, not for a single loss but for an entire way of life slipping away. Yet even in this atmosphere, life continued. People fell in love, raised families, laughed on stoops during summer evenings. Music played from open windows. Community ties, though strained, still existed. This coexistence of normalcy and crisis made the coming storm even more devastating. Crack did not arrive in a vacuum, it inserted itself into living, breathing communities, amplifying existing wounds rather than creating new ones from nothing. This backdrop is essential to understanding how someone like Rayful Edmond III could rise without immediate resistance. The city was not watching closely enough, not because it did not care, but because it was overwhelmed. Too many problems competed for attention, and the systems meant to protect communities were already stretched thin. In such conditions, a disciplined, quiet operator could move freely, unnoticed amid louder chaos. As the decade progressed, the signs became harder to ignore. The calm before the storm gave way to visible decay. But in these earlier moments, Washington still existed in a fragile balance, wounded, strained, but not yet fully consumed. It was within this narrow window that an invisible empire began to take shape, drawing strength from the city's weaknesses and patience from its distractions. The storm was coming, and when it arrived, it would reshape everything. Rayful Edmond III was born into a Washington that offered no simple narratives of good and bad, success and failure. His early life unfolded in a city where opportunity and limitation existed side by side, often within the same block. From a young age, he learned to observe more than he spoke, to read people before trusting them, and to understand that survival depended as much on awareness as it did on action. These lessons were not taught formally, they were absorbed through daily experience, through watching adults navigate a system that rarely worked in their favor. Family played a central role in shaping his worldview. Edmond grew up in a household where responsibility was understood early, and where independence was not encouraged so much as required. Money was something to be managed carefully, never wasted, and rarely discussed openly. Like many families in Washington's overlooked neighborhoods, his lived within a framework of quiet resilience. There was no expectation that the city, the government, or distant institutions would intervene to make life easier. Stability, when it existed, came from within the home and the immediate community. As a child, Edmond moved through his neighborhood with a keen sense of perception. He noticed patterns others overlooked, which streets grew quiet at certain hours, which faces commanded respect, which voices carried weight even when spoken softly. He saw how authority functioned differently depending on where one stood. Police presence felt inconsistent, sometimes intense, sometimes absent altogether. This irregularity taught him that rules were not fixed truths but flexible forces, applied unevenly and often without explanation. School offered structure but little inspiration. Classrooms were crowded, resources limited, and expectations modest. Edmond was not known as disruptive or attention-seeking. If anything, he blended into the background, completing what was required without drawing notice. Teachers might have described him as capable but unremarkable, a student who did enough to get by and little more. Yet beneath that surface calm, his mind remained active, cataloging information and assessing the systems around him. Outside of school, the streets provided a different education. Older teenagers and young adults served as informal instructors, demonstrating both the rewards and the risks of various paths. Edmond watched those who chased quick money and fast reputations burn out just as quickly, undone by arrests, addiction, or violence. He also observed a smaller number of individuals who operated quietly, who never seemed desperate, who always appeared to have resources when others did not. These were the figures who intrigued him most, not because of their power, but because of their restraint. His adolescence coincided with a period when Washington's underground economy was becoming more organized. Small hustles were common, selling stolen goods, acting as lookouts, running errands for older dealers. Edmond did not rush headlong into these activities, but he did not ignore them either. He understood early that information was currency. Knowing who was connected to whom, who could be trusted, and who talked too much was often more valuable than money itself. This instinct for observation would later become one of his defining traits. There were moments when legitimate paths still seemed possible. Like many young people, Edmond likely considered conventional work, stability, and a future that did not involve constant risk. Yet each time those paths narrowed or disappeared, the contrast became clearer. The effort required to succeed legitimately often felt disproportionate to the reward, especially when compared to the visible gains of underground trade. This imbalance did not immediately push him into crime, but it reshaped his understanding of what was practical. The influence of peers cannot be ignored, but it also should not be overstated. Edmond was not swept along by a group or coerced into decisions. He chose carefully, aligning himself with individuals who shared his preference for discretion. Loud personalities and reckless behavior repelled him. He gravitated instead toward those who understood the value of patience and silence. This selective approach helped him avoid many early pitfalls that claimed others his age. At home, expectations remained grounded in survival rather than ambition. Success was defined not by wealth or recognition, but by stability and self-sufficiency. This mindset contributed to Edmond's later approach to power. He was not driven by the need to be admired or feared publicly. His goals, even in youth, were internal: control over his circumstances, insulation from vulnerability, and the ability to move through the world without depending on anyone else's permission. As he grew older, Edmond's awareness of the city's shifting dynamics deepened. He saw how drugs altered behavior, how addiction eroded trust, and how violence escalated when competition intensified. These observations did not deter him as much as they informed him. He learned where chaos created opportunity and where restraint created longevity. While others responded to tension with aggression, Edmond learned to step back, to let situations unfold before choosing his response. By the time he reached late adolescence, he had already developed a reputation, albeit a subtle one. He was known as reliable, calm under pressure, and difficult to read. People trusted him with small tasks, then slightly larger ones, not because he demanded trust but because he rarely betrayed it. Each successful interaction reinforced his standing, creating a foundation that would later support far greater responsibility. Importantly, Edmond's early life was not defined by a single traumatic event or dramatic turning point. There was no moment where everything changed overnight. Instead, his path unfolded gradually, shaped by accumulated experiences and quiet decisions. This slow evolution made his eventual rise more difficult to detect. By the time his influence became undeniable, it had already been years in the making. In reflecting on these formative years, it becomes clear that Edmond was shaped as much by what he avoided as by what he embraced. He avoided attention, avoided unnecessary conflict, and avoided emotional attachment that could cloud judgment. These choices did not make him harmless, but they made him effective. In a city where visibility often invited danger, his instinct to remain unseen became a powerful advantage. This early period laid the groundwork for everything that followed. The child who learned to watch rather than speak, the teenager who valued discipline over bravado, and the young man who understood systems better than slogans would eventually apply these lessons on a much larger scale. At this stage, however, he was still just another face in Washington's overlooked neighborhoods, carrying within him the quiet potential to become something far greater, and far more dangerous, than anyone yet realized. By the time Rayful Edmond III began to take his first deliberate steps into the street economy, Washington had already taught him its most important lesson: nothing moved without a system, and no system survived without discipline. His early involvement was cautious, almost hesitant, not because he feared risk, but because he understood how quickly impatience could destroy a future. Unlike many around him who chased immediate reward, Edmond treated the street economy as something to be studied before it was entered, mapped before it was exploited. His initial activities were small and easily overlooked. Running messages, watching corners, connecting one person to another without inserting himself too deeply. These roles were common entry points, but Edmond approached them differently. He did not boast about his involvement or seek validation. Instead, he paid close attention to how transactions unfolded, how disputes were resolved, and how trust was earned or lost. He noticed that the loudest voices were rarely the most powerful. Real influence belonged to those who could make things happen quietly. Money, at this stage, was secondary. What mattered more was access. Edmond learned where drugs came from, how they moved, and who controlled which pieces of the chain. He observed how quickly street-level dealers could be replaced, and how little loyalty existed when profits were small. This understanding reinforced his belief that real power lay not at the visible edges of the trade, but deeper within its structure. To reach that level required patience and an ability to remain unnoticed. As he became more involved, Edmond developed a reputation for reliability. If he agreed to do something, it was done exactly as promised. If he was given information, it stayed with him. In an environment where betrayal was common and trust was fragile, these qualities were rare and valuable. People began to depend on him, not because he demanded authority, but because he made himself useful without becoming a liability. The street economy also taught Edmond how to manage risk. He saw firsthand how impulsive behavior attracted law enforcement attention. Dealers who flaunted wealth or argued publicly often found themselves arrested or worse. Edmond avoided these traps deliberately. He kept his lifestyle modest, blending into his surroundings rather than standing out. This choice was not accidental, it was a strategy rooted in observation. He understood that survival depended on appearing ordinary. Violence existed all around him, but Edmond treated it as a last resort rather than a tool of control. He noticed that violence created ripples, retaliation, police presence, instability, that disrupted business. While others used fear to command respect, Edmond preferred predictability. People knew what to expect from him, and that consistency reduced conflict. When disputes arose, he sought quiet resolutions whenever possible, reinforcing his image as someone who brought order rather than chaos. During this period, he also learned the importance of compartmentalization. Information was shared on a need-to-know basis, relationships kept separate, and communication minimized. Edmond rarely discussed his activities outside the context where they were necessary. This approach limited exposure and reduced the chances of incriminating connections being drawn. Even early on, he behaved less like a reckless youth and more like a manager protecting an emerging enterprise. Law enforcement presence, while inconsistent, was always a factor. Edmond paid attention to patrol patterns, response times, and the behavior of officers in different neighborhoods. He understood which areas were watched closely and which were largely ignored. This knowledge allowed him to navigate the city with greater confidence, avoiding unnecessary encounters and adjusting his movements accordingly. He did not challenge authority openly, he simply learned how to move around it. As his confidence grew, so did his responsibilities. He began handling larger quantities, coordinating with more people, and managing logistics rather than direct sales. Each step was measured. He tested new roles carefully, ensuring he could handle them without drawing attention. Failures were instructive rather than discouraging. When mistakes occurred, he adjusted his approach rather than reacting emotionally. This phase of his life was marked by a growing awareness of scale. Edmond saw how small operations could expand rapidly under the right conditions, and how fragile that expansion could be without structure. He began to imagine a system that prioritized efficiency, security, and control. These ideas were not yet fully formed, but they guided his decisions. He avoided partnerships that felt unstable and distanced himself from individuals whose behavior threatened long-term survival. The contrast between Edmond and many of his peers became increasingly apparent. While others spent their earnings on visible signs of success, Edmond reinvested quietly, strengthening connections and improving operations. This restraint often made him appear less successful than he actually was, which suited him perfectly. Being underestimated allowed him to operate with fewer obstacles and less scrutiny. Emotionally, Edmond remained guarded. He did not allow personal relationships to interfere with business decisions. This detachment was not necessarily cruelty, but a form of self-protection. In a world where emotional ties could be exploited, distance provided safety. He maintained cordial interactions without revealing vulnerabilities, keeping his inner life largely private. As he transitioned from participant to organizer, Edmond's role shifted almost imperceptibly. Others began to defer to his judgment, seeking his advice and trusting his assessments. He did not demand leadership, it emerged naturally from competence. This organic rise made his authority more durable, as it was based on performance rather than intimidation. By the end of this period, Edmond was no longer merely learning the street economy, he was shaping his place within it. The small, cautious steps he took had accumulated into a FO. When crack cocaine began to spread through Washington, it did not arrive with a single moment of impact. There was no clear line separating the city before it and the city after. Instead, it moved gradually, almost quietly at first, slipping into existing networks and routines before revealing the scale of what it would become. For many residents, the early signs were subtle, a shift in behavior, new faces appearing with unfamiliar urgency, an undercurrent of tension that seemed to hum beneath daily life. For Rayful Edmond III, this period marked something else entirely. It was the moment when observation turned into opportunity. Crack changed the economics of the drug trade in ways few initially understood. Cocaine, once a product associated with wealth and exclusivity, had been transformed into something cheaper, more accessible, and far more addictive. This shift meant that demand was no longer limited to small, specific circles. It spread rapidly across neighborhoods already strained by poverty and neglect. Where heroin had moved slowly and deliberately, crack moved fast, creating constant demand and immediate profit. The scale of potential earnings expanded dramatically, but so did the risks. Many who encountered crack for the first time responded impulsively. They saw quick money and rushed to capitalize on it, flooding streets with product, recruiting indiscriminately, and drawing attention through excess. Violence increased as competition intensified, and law enforcement, though initially unprepared, soon noticed the escalation. These early players often burned brightly and briefly, undone by greed, recklessness, or sheer visibility. Edmond watched all of this unfold from a measured distance. Timing, more than ambition, defined Edmond's response. He did not rush to flood the streets with crack. Instead, he studied how it moved, who controlled supply, and where the bottlenecks existed. He recognized that the true power lay not in selling to users, but in controlling distribution to those who did. This insight placed him several steps ahead of many rivals who focused only on the immediate profits of street-level sales. He also understood that crack's profitability depended on consistency. Users demanded reliable access, and disruptions created instability that attracted unwanted attention. Edmond's approach emphasized steady flow rather than maximum exposure. He worked to ensure that those connected to him could depend on regular supply, reducing chaos and competition within his sphere. This predictability fostered loyalty and minimized conflict, allowing his network to expand quietly. As crack spread, Edmond began to consolidate relationships with suppliers who could meet the growing demand. These connections extended beyond Washington, linking him to larger trafficking routes that fed multiple cities. Managing these relationships required discretion and trust, both of which Edmond had cultivated carefully. He avoided unnecessary intermediaries, limiting points of failure and reducing the risk of infiltration. At the same time, he refined his organizational structure. Rather than expanding rapidly in all directions, he focused on key areas, establishing control through trusted lieutenants. Each person within his network had a defined role and limited knowledge of the larger operation. This compartmentalization protected the whole if individual pieces failed. It also reinforced Edmond's invisibility, as few could accurately describe the scope of his influence. The impact of crack on the city was immediate and devastating. Neighborhoods already struggling were overwhelmed by addiction, violence, and fear. Emergency rooms filled with overdose victims. Families watched loved ones change almost overnight. The speed of this transformation shocked even seasoned observers. Yet from Edmond's perspective, the chaos underscored the importance of discipline. Disorder created opportunity, but only for those who could navigate it without being consumed. He resisted the temptation to live lavishly despite the influx of money. Flashy displays of wealth were common among dealers eager to announce their success. Edmond avoided this path deliberately. He understood that visibility was the enemy of longevity. By maintaining a low profile, he reduced suspicion and allowed others to underestimate him. This restraint also reinforced his internal control, preventing emotional decisions driven by ego. Law enforcement initially struggled to respond effectively. The sheer volume of drug activity overwhelmed existing resources. Arrests focused on street-level dealers, creating an illusion of progress while leaving deeper structures intact. Edmond benefited from this focus, as his role remained largely unseen. He was not the face of the problem, and therefore not its immediate target. During this period, Edmond's confidence grew, but it remained carefully managed. Each expansion was tested, each new connection evaluated. He learned from mistakes, adjusting strategies to account for shifting conditions. When violence flared in certain areas, he rerouted operations to avoid attention. When supply tightened, he diversified sources. This adaptability allowed his network to remain resilient in an environment where others collapsed. Emotionally, the crack explosion forced Edmond to confront the consequences of his actions more directly. He could not ignore the devastation unfolding around him, even if he did not publicly acknowledge it. Yet this awareness did not deter him. Instead, it reinforced a sense of inevitability. The market existed, the demand was relentless, and someone would fill that role regardless. Edmond chose to be the one who did it efficiently, quietly, and with control. As months turned into years, his operation grew into one of the most significant in the city. By the late 1980s, he was supplying vast portions of Washington's crack market, generating millions of dollars in revenue. Remarkably, this expansion occurred without a corresponding increase in his public profile. To most residents, he remained unknown. To law enforcement, he was a rumor, a suspected presence without a clear outline. This period marked the true transformation of Rayful Edmond III from a careful operator into a dominant force. Crack had provided the catalyst, but it was his timing, restraint, and strategic vision that allowed him to capitalize on it fully. He did not create the epidemic, but he mastered its mechanics. And in doing so, he positioned himself at the center of a storm that would eventually draw the full attention of the city, the nation, and the justice system. As the crack era intensified, Washington began to change in ways that could not be reversed. The foundations of Edmond's empire were now firmly in place, built during this critical window when opportunity met preparation. The invisible king had emerged not through force or spectacle, but through patience and precision. And while the city struggled to understand what was happening to it, Edmond moved calmly within the chaos, already aware that the same forces lifting him upward would one day begin to close in around him. As Rayful Edmond III's influence expanded across Washington, the true strength of his operation became increasingly clear. It was not the drugs themselves, nor the money they generated, that set his organization apart. It was the structure. In a city where many criminal networks rose and collapsed in cycles of chaos, Edmond built something that resembled a disciplined system rather than a reckless hustle. Order was not a byproduct of his success, it was the foundation of it. From the beginning, Edmond understood that scale demanded organization. Small operations could survive on personality and improvisation, but large ones could not. As his reach widened, he carefully defined roles within his network. There were individuals responsible for distribution, others for transportation, and others for managing money. No one person held complete knowledge of the entire operation. This compartmentalization ensured that even if someone was arrested or chose to cooperate, the damage would be limited. The system was designed to absorb losses without collapsing. Trust was handled with similar precision. Edmond did not rely on friendship or loyalty alone. He relied on consistency and predictability. People were chosen not for charisma, but for reliability. Those who followed instructions and avoided unnecessary attention were rewarded with stability and continued access. Those who acted impulsively were quietly removed or sidelined. There were consequences for mistakes, but they were often subtle rather than dramatic. The absence of spectacle reinforced discipline more effectively than fear ever could. Communication within the organization was deliberate and restrained. Edmond minimized direct contact whenever possible, using intermediaries and indirect channels to reduce exposure. Conversations were brief, focused, and often coded. There was no room for casual discussion about business matters. This approach created an atmosphere where everyone understood the importance of silence. Words, like actions, were treated as potential risks. Territory was managed with care. Rather than attempting to dominate every possible area, Edmond focused on maintaining strong control over key zones. These areas were supplied consistently, and conflicts were discouraged. By ensuring that his network met demand reliably, he reduced competition and violence within his sphere. Stability benefited everyone involved, and that stability became a selling point in itself. Violence, when it occurred, was calculated and contained. Edmond recognized that excessive force attracted attention and destabilized operations. He preferred solutions that resolved problems quietly, through negotiation, separation, or strategic withdrawal. When enforcement was necessary, it was decisive but discreet. This approach preserved order and minimized the kind of chaos that drew law enforcement scrutiny. Money management was another pillar of Edmond's system. Profits were tracked carefully, laundered through various channels, and reinvested strategically. Edmond avoided sudden, conspicuous spending that could raise suspicion. Financial discipline reinforced operational discipline, creating a feedback loop that strengthened the entire organization. The flow of money mirrored the flow of product, steady, controlled, and largely invisible. As the organization grew, Edmond's leadership style remained consistent. He did not rule through intimidation or constant oversight. Instead, he set expectations clearly and allowed others to operate within defined boundaries. This delegation reduced his direct involvement in daily activities, further insulating him from exposure. It also empowered trusted lieutenants, creating layers of leadership that maintained order even in his absence. The atmosphere within Edmond's network was notably different from that of rival groups. There was less posturing, fewer public displays of dominance, and more emphasis on routine. This predictability reduced stress and conflict among members, making the organization more resilient. People knew their roles and understood the consequences of deviation. In a chaotic environment, this sense of order was both rare and valuable. Law enforcement agencies, meanwhile, struggled to penetrate this structure. Traditional tactics focused on street-level arrests and visible disruptions. Edmond's organization, by contrast, operated like a shadow, absorbing losses without revealing its core. Each arrest removed a piece, but the system adjusted, filling gaps and continuing operations. Investigators found it difficult to identify a single leader or trace a clear chain of command. Edmond's insistence on discipline also extended to personal conduct. He discouraged substance abuse within his inner circle, recognizing how addiction compromised judgment and security. Those who could not maintain control over themselves were seen as liabilities. This expectation further differentiated his organization from others ravaged by the very product they sold. Despite the calm exterior, maintaining such order required constant vigilance. Edmond remained attentive to shifts in behavior, changes in law enforcement patterns, and emerging threats. He adapted rules and procedures as needed, refining the system in response to new challenges. This flexibility prevented stagnation and allowed the organization to evolve alongside the city's changing landscape. The success of this structure reinforced Edmond's belief in remaining invisible. He avoided unnecessary appearances and kept his personal life separate from his operations. To many within his network, he was more concept than presence, a figure whose decisions shaped outcomes without frequent direct interaction. This distance enhanced his authority while reducing his vulnerability. Over time, Edmond's organization became one of the most stable and profitable in Washington. Its efficiency stood in stark contrast to the surrounding chaos, making it both effective and dangerous. The city felt the impact in rising addiction rates and deepening social wounds, while Edmond's system continued to function smoothly, largely undisturbed. This period represented the peak of Edmond's control. He had built an empire not through brute force, but through discipline, restraint, and an almost corporate approach to crime. Yet the very qualities that made his organization strong also created a false sense of security. Systems, no matter how well designed, are only as strong as the people within them. And as time passed, the pressure of scale, scrutiny, and human weakness began to test even the most carefully constructed order. For now, however, Rayful Edmond III remained firmly in command, an invisible king ruling through structure rather than spectacle. His organization moved quietly through Washington, its presence felt everywhere and seen almost nowhere, embodying a form of power that thrived in silence. By the late 1980s, Rayful Edmond III had achieved something few figures in Washington's criminal underworld ever managed. He was powerful without being visible. In a city where notoriety often preceded downfall, Edmond moved in the opposite direction, deliberately erasing himself from the narrative even as his influence expanded. People felt his presence daily, yet struggled to describe him. This absence was not a weakness. It was the central pillar of his reign. Edmond understood that attention was a currency more dangerous than money. Many drug traffickers sought recognition, believing fear and fame would protect them. Edmond believed the opposite. He avoided nightclubs, stayed away from public gatherings, and rarely appeared in places associated with power. There were no flashy cars, no lavish parties, no entourage announcing his arrival. To the casual observer, he looked like just another man moving through the city, unremarkable and forgettable. This ordinariness was intentional. His invisibility extended beyond appearance. He avoided patterns that could be tracked. Schedules were irregular, routes changed frequently, and meetings were kept brief. He relied on intermediaries for communication, reducing the number of people who interacted with him directly. Even those within his organization often knew him only through reputation and instruction, not personal familiarity. This distance made it difficult to form a clear picture of who he was or how he operated. Law enforcement found this particularly frustrating. Investigators heard his name repeatedly, whispered by informants and suspects, yet struggled to attach it to concrete evidence. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public incidents that forced him into the spotlight. Each time police moved against street-level operations, Edmond remained untouched, his role obscured by layers of separation. He became a rumor with substance but no face. This strategy of invisibility also shaped how others perceived him. Within the drug trade, mystique became a form of power. People spoke of Edmond with a mixture of respect and uncertainty. The lack of direct interaction magnified his authority, allowing imagination to fill in the gaps. Decisions attributed to him carried weight precisely because he did not need to enforce them personally. His word traveled through the network quietly, accepted without challenge. Edmond's personal life reflected the same philosophy. He kept it simple, avoiding displays that might invite curiosity. He did not cultivate friendships that blurred boundaries or invited scrutiny. Emotional distance protected him, even if it also isolated him. In a world where betrayal was a constant threat, isolation felt safer than intimacy. This invisibility had practical advantages beyond avoiding law enforcement. It reduced internal conflict by minimizing personal rivalries. Without a visible leader to challenge, ambitious figures within the organization focused on their roles rather than competing for dominance. Edmond's absence from daily operations encouraged stability, as decisions flowed through established channels rather than personal whims. Yet this strategy required constant self-discipline. Remaining invisible meant resisting temptations that came with power. Edmond could have enjoyed wealth openly, commanded attention, or asserted dominance publicly. Each time he chose restraint, he reinforced his control. The discipline that defined his organization also defined him. The city around him continued to change. Crack cocaine reshaped neighborhoods at an alarming pace, drawing national attention to Washington's crisis. Media coverage intensified, painting vivid pictures of addiction and violence. Politicians demanded action. Law enforcement agencies expanded task forces and resources. Through all of this, Edmond remained in the background, his name absent from headlines even as his network supplied much of the city's drug trade. This absence created a dangerous illusion. To outsiders, the crisis seemed chaotic and leaderless, the product of countless independent actors rather than coordinated systems. This misperception delayed effective responses, allowing Edmond's operation to grow deeper roots. Invisibility did not just protect him, it distorted the understanding of the problem itself. There was also a psychological dimension to Edmond's strategy. Power exercised from a distance can feel less burdensome. By avoiding direct confrontation and emotional engagement, he shielded himself from the stress that consumed more visible leaders. He did not need to constantly assert authority, the system did that for him. This detachment allowed him to think strategically rather than reactively. However, invisibility carried its own risks. It relied heavily on trust in intermediaries and the integrity of systems. Edmond had to believe that instructions would be followed accurately and that loyalty would endure without constant reinforcement. Each layer of separation introduced potential vulnerabilities. A single weak link could compromise the whole. Despite these risks, Edmond maintained his approach, refining it as his influence grew. He monitored shifts in law enforcement tactics, adjusted communication methods, and periodically reshuffled roles to prevent complacency. His invisibility was not passive, it required active maintenance. Those who encountered Edmond directly often remarked on his calm demeanor. He did not raise his voice or seek to dominate conversations. His authority came from certainty rather than aggression. This composure reinforced his image as someone in control, even in situations that might provoke anxiety in others. It also made him difficult to read, an advantage in negotiations and conflict resolution. As the decade neared its end, Edmond's invisibility reached its peak effectiveness. He controlled vast distribution networks, generated immense profits, and influenced the daily lives of countless people, all while remaining largely unknown to the broader public. His power was diffuse, embedded in systems rather than embodied in a single, visible figure. Yet history suggests that invisibility is rarely permanent. The very scale that allowed Edmond to hide also increased the likelihood of exposure. The more people involved, the greater the chance that someone would talk, make a mistake, or draw attention. In remaining unseen, Edmond delayed confrontation, but he did not eliminate it. At this stage, however, he stood as Washington's invisible king, ruling without spectacle, commanding without presence. His story challenges conventional images of criminal power, revealing how silence, restraint, and absence can be as formidable as violence and fear. And as the city struggled to comprehend the forces shaping its crisis, Edmond continued to move quietly through the shadows, his reign sustained by the very fact that most people never saw him at all. As Rayful Edmond III's organization expanded quietly beneath the surface, the visible world above it began to fracture in ways that could no longer be ignored. The spread of crack cocaine did not remain confined to statistics or police reports, it seeped into daily life, altering the rhythms of entire neighborhoods. Streets that once carried the sounds of conversation and routine slowly filled with tension. Windows stayed closed longer. Parents watched more carefully. The damage unfolded not in a single dramatic collapse, but in countless small moments that accumulated into a shared sense of loss. Families were often the first to feel the change. Loved ones who once returned home predictably began to disappear for days at a time, drawn into cycles of addiction that felt both sudden and irreversible. Trust eroded quietly as money went missing and tempers flared. Children learned to navigate uncertainty early, sensing when it was safer to stay inside, when it was better not to ask questions. These domestic shifts rarely made headlines, yet they represented the deepest wounds inflicted by the epidemic. Public spaces transformed as well. Parks, bus stops, and stairwells took on new meanings, becoming sites of exchange and conflict. The presence of drugs altered how people moved through their own neighborhoods. Fear became an unspoken companion, shaping decisions about where to walk and when to leave home. The sense of community that once provided resilience weakened under constant strain. Emergency rooms became quiet battlegrounds. Medical staff confronted an influx of patients suffering from overdoses, infections, and violence-related injuries. The pace was relentless, leaving little time for reflection or recovery. For those working within these systems, the crisis felt endless, each shift blurring into the next. The human cost was measured not just in lives lost, but in exhaustion and emotional burnout. Schools, too, bore the weight of the epidemic. Teachers watched students struggle with instability at home, their attention divided between lessons and survival. Attendance dropped. Behavior changed. The future, once imagined with some degree of optimism, felt increasingly uncertain. For many young people, the streets offered a distorted sense of opportunity that formal institutions could not match. Violence, while not constant, flared unpredictably. Disputes over territory, money, or respect escalated quickly, often with devastating consequences. Each incident reinforced a cycle of fear and retaliation, drawing law enforcement deeper into communities already wary of authority. Patrol cars became a more common sight, yet their presence did little to restore a sense of safety. Instead, it highlighted the breakdown of trust between residents and institutions meant to protect them. Within this environment, Rayful Edmond III remained largely unseen. His organization supplied the demand fueling much of the crisis, yet his name rarely surfaced outside specific circles. This distance created a moral and emotional disconnect. The damage was visible everywhere, but its source felt abstract, almost faceless. It was easier to blame circumstances, substances, or anonymous networks than to confront a single individual orchestrating much of the flow. For those within Edmond's network, this detachment was both protective and troubling. They witnessed the consequences of their work firsthand, yet operated within a system that prioritized efficiency over reflection. Some rationalized their roles as inevitable, arguing that demand existed regardless of who supplied it. Others compartmentalized, separating their personal lives from their activities to avoid confronting the full impact of their actions. The neighborhoods most affected by the epidemic experienced a slow erosion of hope. Businesses closed or relocated, unable to operate amid instability. Property values declined, trapping residents who lacked the means to leave. Social services struggled to meet growing needs, stretched thin by limited funding and overwhelming demand. The sense of being forgotten deepened, reinforcing cycles of despair. Media coverage, when it came, often focused on sensational aspects of the crisis, crime scenes, arrest numbers, dramatic footage. These portrayals rarely captured the quieter suffering unfolding behind closed doors. They also failed to illuminate the systemic nature of the problem, reducing it to individual choices rather than collective failure. This simplification obscured the role of organized networks like Edmond's, allowing them to continue operating in relative anonymity. For Rayful Edmond III, the human cost of the epidemic was an unavoidable backdrop to his success. He did not live in isolation from its effects. He moved through the same city, saw the same changes, and felt the same tensions. Yet his response remained pragmatic rather than emotional. He viewed the situation as a system responding to forces beyond any single individual's control. This perspective allowed him to maintain focus, even as the city around him deteriorated. This detachment, however, came at a price. As suffering increased, so did scrutiny. Community leaders, activists, and law enforcement began to push for more aggressive responses. Federal attention grew, drawn by the scale of the crisis and its implications for national policy. The very devastation that fueled Edmond's profits also set in motion the forces that would eventually challenge his invisibility. The contrast between Edmond's quiet control and the visible chaos of the streets grew starker with each passing year. His operation functioned smoothly, almost efficiently, while the communities it fed into struggled to cope with the fallout. This imbalance underscored a central tension in his story, the separation between power and consequence, between those who orchestrate systems and those who endure their effects. As the city grappled with addiction, violence, and loss, the invisible king remained in the background, his presence inferred rather than observed. The human cost of his empire continued to mount, etched into the lives of families, the fabric of neighborhoods, and the collective memory of a city in crisis. And while this suffering did not immediately alter Edmond's course, it ensured that his story would not remain hidden forever. The damage was too great, the impact too widespread, for the source to remain unseen indefinitely. As the crack epidemic tightened its grip on Washington, the scale of the devastation began to attract attention that could no longer be deflected by routine arrests or surface-level explanations. What had once seemed like a collection of isolated problems was now clearly a coordinated crisis. Law enforcement agencies, overwhelmed at first, slowly began to realize that the chaos on the streets was not random. There were patterns, consistent supply, stable pricing, and distribution networks that regenerated almost immediately after disruption. Behind the noise, something organized was operating with precision. Local police were the first to sense it. Officers working the same neighborhoods day after day noticed that arrests rarely disrupted availability. Dealers came and went, but the product remained. Even when entire corners were cleared, activity resumed with remarkable speed. This resilience suggested leadership somewhere above street level, someone who could replace losses without hesitation. Yet identifying that figure proved difficult. Witnesses were reluctant, records were fragmented, and the layers of separation obscured any clear chain of command. Federal agencies soon became involved, drawn by the sheer volume of drugs moving through the city. The scale of the problem suggested connections beyond Washington, raising concerns about interstate trafficking and broader criminal networks. Task forces were assembled, bringing together local, federal, and sometimes even military resources. These collaborations marked a shift in approach, from reactive policing to strategic investigation. Investigators began by listening. Informants, often motivated by reduced sentences or financial incentives, provided fragments of information. Names surfaced repeatedly, but rarely with enough detail to build a case. Rayful Edmond III was among those names, spoken cautiously, often without clarity. Some informants described him as a supplier, others as a coordinator, still others as a shadowy presence they had never met. This inconsistency frustrated investigators, but it also hinted at the sophistication of the operation. Wiretaps became a critical tool. Authorities sought to intercept communications that could reveal the structure of the network. However, Edmond's emphasis on indirect communication and minimal exposure complicated these efforts. Conversations were brief, coded, and often routed through multiple intermediaries. Each intercepted call raised more questions than answers, revealing activity without clearly identifying its source. Financial investigations offered another avenue. Money left traces, even when carefully managed. Analysts tracked suspicious transactions, cash flows, and asset purchases, searching for patterns that could link street-level activity to higher-level control. These efforts required patience and expertise, as Edmond's organization avoided obvious red flags. Assets were often held in others' names, funds moved through layers of intermediaries, and spending remained deliberately modest. As evidence slowly accumulated, a picture began to form, not of a flamboyant kingpin, but of a disciplined organizer operating with remarkable restraint. This realization challenged assumptions held by many investigators accustomed to more visible targets. Edmond did not fit the stereotype. He did not boast, threaten publicly, or leave obvious signatures. Instead, his influence was inferred from absence, his ability to remain untouched while others fell. The investigation progressed unevenly, marked by setbacks and breakthroughs. Informants disappeared or recanted. Cases collapsed due to lack of corroboration. Each failure reinforced the sense that Edmond's invisibility was not accidental, but engineered. The more investigators learned, the more they recognized the need for long-term strategy rather than quick results. This shift in approach required institutional patience, something not always easy to maintain amid public pressure. Politicians demanded visible progress. Communities demanded safety. Media scrutiny intensified. Yet building a case against an invisible figure required time, coordination, and restraint. Investigators had to resist the urge to act prematurely, understanding that partial success could jeopardize the entire effort. Within Edmond's organization, awareness of law enforcement interest grew gradually. Arrests of associates signaled increased scrutiny, but the core remained intact. Edmond adjusted operations subtly, refining communication methods and reinforcing discipline. He did not panic or overreact, trusting in the system he had built. This calm response further delayed exposure, buying him time even as pressure mounted. The dynamic between Edmond and law enforcement became a quiet chess match. Each side tested the other's limits, probing for weaknesses. Investigators learned to read between the lines, while Edmond worked to erase those lines entirely. This interplay unfolded largely out of public view, overshadowed by more visible aspects of the crisis. As months turned into years, the investigation deepened. Data accumulated, relationships were mapped, and inconsistencies analyzed. Slowly, the outline of Edmond's empire became clearer. It was not a single organization, but a network of interconnected cells, each operating semi-independently. This structure explained both its resilience and the difficulty of dismantling it. The recognition of Edmond as a central figure marked a turning point. He was no longer just a name among many, but a focus of sustained attention. This shift brought resources and determination, but it also raised the stakes. A misstep could alert him, prompting further adaptation or escape. Despite the growing awareness, Edmond remained physically distant from the investigation. He was not the subject of dramatic raids or public confrontations. His life appeared unchanged, reinforcing the unsettling sense that the most influential players often move unnoticed. This invisibility, however, was becoming harder to maintain. The city's suffering had forced a reckoning. The patterns were too clear, the damage too extensive to ignore. Law enforcement's pursuit of Rayful Edmond III was no longer speculative, it was deliberate. The hunt had begun in earnest, even if its progress remained slow and methodical. For the city, this shift offered a glimmer of hope, though tempered by uncertainty. The realization that the crisis had a source suggested the possibility of resolution. Yet the complexity of the task ahead made clear that any victory would come at a cost. The invisible king had been identified, but bringing him into the light would require patience, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to unraveling a system designed to remain unseen. As the investigation advanced, the balance began to tilt, almost imperceptibly. Edmond's empire still functioned, but the walls were closing in. The quiet game of observation and restraint was nearing a critical phase, one that would test the limits of both Edmond's invisibility and the determination of those seeking to end his reign. As pressure from law enforcement slowly intensified, the outward appearance of Rayful Edmond III's operation remained calm and controlled. On the surface, nothing seemed to change. Supply continued to flow, money moved as it always had, and the routines within his network stayed intact. Yet beneath this steady exterior, subtle shifts were taking place. The cost of remaining invisible was rising, and Edmond felt it in ways that were not immediately visible to those around him. Paranoia did not arrive suddenly. It crept in gradually, disguised as caution. Edmond had always valued discretion, but now that instinct sharpened into something more consuming. Every conversation was weighed carefully. Every delay, every deviation from routine, was examined for meaning. Trust, once extended selectively, became even more tightly controlled. The circle of people he relied on grew smaller, not because he feared betrayal without cause, but because scale itself had become a risk. Edmond began to limit his exposure further, reducing in-person meetings and relying more heavily on intermediaries. This distance protected him, but it also introduced new vulnerabilities. Messages passed through multiple hands could be misunderstood or distorted. Decisions took longer to implement. The efficiency that once defined his organization began to strain under the weight of overcaution. Maintaining control required constant vigilance, and that vigilance demanded energy. Within the organization, these changes were felt quietly. Longtime associates noticed shifts in tone and behavior. Instructions became more specific, less flexible. Deviations that might once have been tolerated were now addressed swiftly. Edmond's emphasis on discipline intensified, not out of cruelty, but necessity. He understood that even minor mistakes could attract attention at this stage. The margin for error was shrinking. Isolation became another consequence of his heightened caution. Edmond had never been emotionally open, but now he withdrew further, keeping even trusted lieutenants at arm's length. This separation reinforced his invisibility, but it also increased his sense of solitude. Leadership, when exercised in silence, can become a lonely endeavor. The weight of decisions rested solely on him, with fewer opportunities to share responsibility or doubt. Sleep, once routine, became less predictable. The mind that had always been alert now struggled to rest fully. Edmond replayed scenarios repeatedly, anticipating threats and imagining outcomes. This constant mental rehearsal was both a strength and a burden. It kept him prepared, but it also deepened his sense of unease. The city felt closer, smaller, as though its walls were inching inward. The paradox of power revealed itself during this period. At the height of his influence, Edmond's freedom was at its most restricted. Every movement was calculated. Every interaction carried potential risk. Wealth and control, rather than providing comfort, demanded greater vigilance. The very success he had engineered now required relentless maintenance. Trust within the organization also began to shift subtly. While Edmond's authority remained unquestioned, the emotional bond between leader and network weakened. Associates followed instructions, but fewer felt personally connected to him. This distance reduced the likelihood of impulsive betrayal, but it also eroded loyalty rooted in relationship rather than obligation. The organization functioned efficiently, but with a colder tone. External pressures reinforced these internal dynamics. News of arrests, seizures, and investigations filtered through the network, each incident a reminder that scrutiny was increasing. Even when Edmond's name was not mentioned, the message was clear: the environment was becoming less forgiving. He responded by tightening controls further, reinforcing procedures and minimizing exposure wherever possible. This cycle of pressure and control fed into itself. The more Edmond sought to protect his invisibility, the more constrained his operation became. Flexibility, once a strength, diminished. Adaptation slowed. While the system remained robust, it lost some of the fluidity that had allowed it to thrive under changing conditions. Emotionally, Edmond remained composed, at least outwardly. He did not lash out or make erratic decisions. His response to mounting pressure was measured, deliberate. Yet this composure masked an internal tension that could not be fully resolved. The awareness that his empire might not remain invisible indefinitely lingered constantly, shaping every choice. The people closest to him sensed this tension, even if they did not fully understand it. Conversations grew shorter. Meetings became more transactional. The warmth, however limited, that once existed gave way to formality. Edmond's leadership style evolved from quiet guidance to precise control, reflecting the narrowing space in which he operated. Despite these challenges, Edmond's system continued to function. This persistence reinforced his belief in the structure he had built. Each day without exposure felt like validation, proof that discipline and restraint could outlast scrutiny. Yet each day also added to the mental weight he carried, the awareness that time was no longer an ally. This period marked a subtle turning point. The rise had ended, replaced by a tense equilibrium. Edmond was no longer expanding aggressively, but defending what he had built. Power had shifted from growth to preservation, from ambition to survival. The invisible king remained in control, but the cost of that control was increasing steadily. In the quiet moments, when the city slept and his network moved without incident, Edmond confronted a reality he had long kept at bay. No system, no matter how carefully constructed, could remain untouched forever. The question was no longer if scrutiny would reach him, but when, and in what form. For now, he continued to manage his empire with precision, tightening his grip as the walls slowly closed in, aware that the balance he maintained was becoming more fragile with each passing day. No empire, no matter how disciplined, is immune to the quiet forces that erode it from within. For Rayful Edmond III, the greatest threat did not arrive in the form of a dramatic raid or a rival's challenge. It emerged slowly, through fractures that were almost invisible at first. As pressure mounted from outside, strain increased inside the system he had built so carefully. People, not structures, became the weakest links. The earliest signs of trouble were subtle. Associates began making small mistakes, missed communications, minor deviations from routine, moments of hesitation that suggested uncertainty. None of these alone threatened the organization, but together they hinted at a growing unease. The constant presence of law enforcement pressure had begun to wear down those further from the center, individuals who lacked Edmond's discipline or long-term perspective. Fear has a way of reshaping loyalty. For years, Edmond's network had thrived on predictability and controlled risk. Now, as arrests increased and sentences grew harsher, the cost of involvement became clearer to everyone. Some members began to question whether the stability Edmond offered was enough to justify the danger. These doubts rarely surfaced openly. Instead, they manifested in guarded behavior and emotional distance. Informants emerged not out of malice, but survival. Individuals facing long prison sentences weighed loyalty against freedom. For many, cooperation with authorities seemed less like betrayal and more like an escape. Law enforcement understood this psychology well, offering reduced sentences, protection, or financial incentives in exchange for information. Each agreement chipped away at the wall of silence that had shielded Edmond. What made these betrayals particularly dangerous was their unpredictability. Edmond had built his system to limit exposure, but no design could fully account for human fear. An informant did not need complete knowledge to be useful. Fragments of information, when combined with others, could reveal patterns. The mosaic of Edmond's operation began to take shape in investigators' hands, piece by piece. Within the organization, suspicion grew. Edmond sensed shifts in behavior, subtle changes in tone that suggested people were holding back. Trust, already scarce, became even more fragile. He responded by narrowing his circle further, relying on fewer individuals and limiting communication. While this reduced immediate risk, it also intensified pressure on those who remained, increasing their stress and potential for error. The emotional climate within the network changed. Conversations that once felt routine now carried an undercurrent of tension. Associates wondered who might be cooperating, who could be trusted. This atmosphere of suspicion weakened cohesion, replacing confidence with caution. People began to protect themselves first, a natural response in an environment where survival felt increasingly uncertain. Betrayal did not always take the form of direct cooperation. Some individuals simply withdrew, reducing their involvement or making themselves scarce. Others made mistakes under pressure, drawing attention through carelessness. Each misstep created openings for law enforcement, reinforcing the sense that the organization's invisibility was fading. Edmond's leadership was tested in new ways. He had always relied on discipline rather than fear, but discipline alone could not eliminate doubt. He faced the challenge of maintaining control without resorting to overt displays of force that could destabilize everything he had built. His response remained measured, but the margin for error continued to shrink. Law enforcement capitalized on these internal fractures. Investigators compared notes, cross-referenced informant statements, and identified inconsistencies that pointed toward higher-level coordination. Each piece of information, however small, added clarity. The once blurred outline of Edmond's empire grew sharper, its connections more defined. The psychological toll on Edmond intensified. He understood that betrayal was inevitable at this stage, yet knowing this did not make it easier to endure. Each arrest raised questions. Each rumor carried potential danger. He found himself reassessing past decisions, wondering whether certain alliances should have been avoided or severed earlier. These reflections, though necessary, added to the mental burden he carried. Despite these challenges, Edmond did not lose control entirely. His system still functioned, and many associates remained loyal, bound by shared history and mutual dependence. Yet the balance had shifted. The organization was no longer expanding or even maintaining itself with ease. It was in a state of managed decline, held together by constant effort rather than natural momentum. The betrayal phase also revealed the limits of invisibility. Edmond had relied on distance to protect himself, but distance could not prevent people from talking once fear took hold. The same separation that shielded him now made it harder to reinforce loyalty or address concerns directly. Leadership from the shadows had its advantages, but it also created gaps that could not always be filled. As information flowed steadily toward investigators, Edmond's name appeared with increasing frequency. The whispers grew louder, more consistent. Patterns once dismissed as coincidence now appeared intentional. The invisible king was becoming visible, not through spectacle, but through accumulation. For the city, these betrayals represented a turning point. The crisis that had seemed overwhelming and amorphous began to feel more defined, more confrontable. There was a sense, however cautious, that the source of much suffering might finally be within reach. For Edmond, this period marked the beginning of the end, though its conclusion was not yet clear. He remained calm outwardly, continuing to manage what he could, adjusting strategies as information leaked. Yet the foundation of silence that had sustained his reign was cracking. The betrayals, driven by fear and self-preservation, were reshaping the landscape around him. In the quiet spaces between decisions, Edmond confronted an uncomfortable truth. Power built on secrecy is only as strong as the people who keep it. And people, under enough pressure, will eventually choose themselves. The invisible empire was no longer sealed. It was leaking, slowly but steadily, toward an inevitable reckoning. When the case against Rayful Edmond III finally moved into the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted from shadows to fluorescent light, from whispered suspicion to formal record. The trial was not dramatic in the way popular culture often imagines criminal proceedings. There were no sudden confessions, no emotional outbursts that changed everything in a moment. Instead, it unfolded slowly and methodically, much like the investigation that preceded it. This pace suited the nature of the man at its center. Edmond had built his empire quietly, and its dismantling followed the same rhythm. By the time proceedings began, Edmond's name was no longer a rumor. It appeared in indictments, affidavits, and carefully prepared statements. Years of investigation had transformed fragments of information into a coherent narrative. Prosecutors did not rely on spectacle, they relied on accumulation. Each piece of evidence was small on its own, but together they formed a picture that was difficult to ignore. The courtroom itself was calm, almost subdued. Legal language replaced street code. Where once decisions were passed through intermediaries in silence, now they were spoken aloud, recorded, and preserved. Edmond sat quietly, composed, his demeanor offering little insight into his thoughts. Those who expected visible fear or anger found none. He listened, absorbed, and waited, much as he always had. Testimony formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. Former associates took the stand one by one, their voices steady but often restrained. Some spoke out of self-interest, others out of resignation. Each account added detail to the structure Edmond had worked so hard to obscure. They described distribution routes, financial arrangements, coded communications, and the unspoken rules that governed the organization. None of them portrayed Edmond as flamboyant or impulsive. Instead, they described a figure who was deliberate, controlled, and distant. This consistency worked against him. There were no contradictions to exploit, no wildly different portrayals to undermine credibility. The witnesses, though varied in background and motivation, told similar stories. Their accounts overlapped in ways that reinforced rather than conflicted. The invisible king was becoming visible not through a single revelation, but through repetition. Physical evidence complemented these testimonies. Financial records traced the movement of money through accounts designed to conceal ownership. Seized materials corroborated descriptions of distribution and communication methods. Phone records, though often indirect, established patterns of contact that aligned with witness statements. Each document added weight, grounding spoken words in tangible proof. Edmond's defense focused on the very qualities that had once protected him. His lawyers emphasized distance, arguing that association did not equal control, that proximity did not prove leadership. They pointed out the lack of direct evidence placing him at street-level transactions or violent incidents. They questioned the motives of cooperating witnesses, highlighting the benefits they received in exchange for testimony. These arguments were not without merit. Edmond had indeed insulated himself from direct involvement. He had rarely been present at exchanges, rarely communicated openly. Yet the prosecution countered by reframing leadership itself. Control, they argued, did not require visibility. Influence could be exerted quietly, through structure rather than presence. The organization's consistency and resilience, they suggested, pointed unmistakably toward centralized coordination. As days passed, the trial settled into a rhythm. Jurors listened attentively, absorbing details that painted a picture of a system rather than a single act. The complexity of the case required patience, both from those presenting it and those tasked with judging it. There was no single moment of clarity, no dramatic turning point. Instead, understanding emerged gradually, as layers of information accumulated. For Edmond, this process must have felt both familiar and alien. He was accustomed to managing complexity, to seeing how individual actions fit into larger systems. Now that same complexity was being laid bare, interpreted by others, and judged according to laws he had long navigated from a distance. The courtroom stripped away ambiguity, replacing it with definitions and conclusions. When closing arguments arrived, they were measured rather than theatrical. Prosecutors summarized years of work, emphasizing patterns, consistency, and scale. They reminded jurors that invisibility was not innocence, that power exercised quietly was still power. The defense reiterated doubts, urging caution in relying on testimony from compromised sources. The choice before the jury was not simple, but it was clear. Deliberations took time, reflecting the seriousness of the decision. When the verdict was finally delivered, it carried the weight of inevitability rather than surprise. Guilty. The word echoed softly, without drama, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Edmond received it without visible reaction. There was no outburst, no visible collapse. His composure remained intact, even as the consequences became undeniable. Sentencing followed, bringing with it a reckoning measured in years rather than moments. The court considered the scope of Edmond's activities, the damage inflicted on communities, and the leadership role he played. Life imprisonment was not framed as vengeance, but as response. The scale of the harm required a sentence that reflected permanence. As the judge spoke, the language was formal, restrained, almost clinical. Yet beneath that formality lay an acknowledgement of immense human cost. Entire neighborhoods had been altered, families fractured, futures diminished. Edmond's organization had not acted alone in creating this devastation, but it had amplified it significantly. For those watching, the moment felt strangely quiet. The fall of Washington's invisible king did not arrive with sirens or spectacle. It arrived with paperwork, procedure, and a final declaration from the bench. This quiet ending mirrored the quiet rise that preceded it. Edmond was led away, not in chains of drama, but in the subdued manner typical of courtroom proceedings. The transition from power to confinement was abrupt, yet understated. The systems that once protected him were now irrelevant. Control had shifted entirely. In the aftermath, there was a sense of closure, though not resolution. The conviction marked a significant victory for law enforcement and a symbolic turning point for the city. Yet it did not erase the damage done or restore what had been lost. It simply acknowledged responsibility, assigning a face to a system that had long operated without one. For Edmond himself, the trial and conviction represented the ultimate exposure. His invisibility, carefully maintained for years, had dissolved under sustained scrutiny. The quiet strategies that once ensured survival could not withstand the combined weight of time, pressure, and human frailty. As the courtroom emptied and life outside resumed its routine, the significance of the moment lingered. A man who had ruled through absence now faced a future defined by confinement. His story, once whispered, was now recorded in official history. The Invisible King had been named, judged, and sentenced, not with fanfare, but with the calm finality of a system designed to endure long after individual power fades. The transition from power to confinement happened quickly, but its meaning unfolded slowly. After years of controlling systems that moved through the city at his command, Rayful Edmond III entered a world where time was no longer something he managed. It managed him. Prison life imposed a rhythm that could not be negotiated or bypassed, a structure far more rigid than any he had built. The man who once operated invisibly across neighborhoods now existed within clearly defined walls, his movements measured and monitored. Incarceration stripped away layers of identity that had once provided insulation. There were no intermediaries, no buffers to soften reality. Each day followed the same pattern, marked by counts, meals, and limited interactions. For someone accustomed to control through distance and discipline, this enforced sameness represented a profound shift. The skills that had sustained his empire, observation, restraint, calculation, now served a different purpose: survival within confinement. Edmond adapted quietly. He did not seek attention or attempt to assert dominance. He understood that visibility in prison carried its own risks, much like it had on the streets. Maintaining a low profile became once again a form of protection. He observed, listened, and learned the unspoken rules governing this new environment, much as he had done years earlier in Washington's neighborhoods. The loss of freedom was absolute, but it did not erase his mind or his memories. In the stillness of incarceration, reflection became unavoidable. The pace of life slowed dramatically, leaving ample time to consider the path that led him there. For someone who had always focused on the present and near future, this long horizon of confinement forced a different kind of reckoning. Power, once expressed through influence and coordination, now existed only in memory. The contrast was stark. Decisions that once affected thousands were replaced by choices about how to pass the day, how to manage solitude, how to maintain composure. The psychological adjustment was significant. Control, in its old form, was gone. What remained was internal discipline. Relationships within prison were transactional and limited. Edmond did not arrive as a legend or celebrity. His story, while known to some, did not grant special status. He was one among many, each carrying their own history and regrets. This anonymity, while humbling, also offered a strange continuity. He had always valued being unseen, and in this environment, invisibility again provided safety. Communication with the outside world was restricted and regulated. Letters and calls, when permitted, were filtered through institutional procedures. The immediacy of information was gone. News arrived slowly, often incomplete. This separation reinforced the finality of his situation. The city he once influenced continued to change, but from his perspective, it became distant and abstract. The passage of time in prison has a different texture. Days blend together, marked by routine rather than progress. For Edmond, this monotony contrasted sharply with the dynamic complexity of his former life. The constant mental engagement that once defined his days gave way to repetition. Maintaining mental clarity required effort, discipline, and a willingness to confront boredom without escape. The absence of wealth and privilege further emphasized the shift. Money, once a tool of influence, held little power within the confines of incarceration. Access was limited, equality enforced by circumstance. This leveling effect stripped away illusions of superiority, confronting Edmond with a reality where status meant little and compliance meant everything. Yet within this restrictive environment, Edmond's internal discipline offered some stability. He followed rules, avoided unnecessary conflict, and maintained composure. This approach reduced friction and allowed him to exist without drawing attention. It was a continuation of the strategy that had defined his life, adapted to new constraints. Over time, the weight of a life sentence became more apparent. The future, once filled with plans and contingencies, now stretched out as an unchanging horizon. This permanence forced a deeper form of acceptance. Hope, if it existed, had to be redefined, detached from expectations of release or restoration. For the communities affected by his actions, Edmond's imprisonment represented a form of closure, though not healing. The damage done could not be undone by confinement alone. Addiction, loss, and trauma lingered long after the verdict. His absence from the streets did not erase the systems he had helped build, but it did remove a central figure. Within prison walls, Edmond became a symbol of a different kind of fall. Not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet erasure of influence. His name no longer shaped outcomes or commanded obedience. It existed primarily in records and memories, referenced occasionally but no longer active. The contrast between his former life and his present reality underscored a fundamental truth. Power built on secrecy and control can dissolve completely once its foundation is removed. The systems that once protected Edmond were irrelevant here. There were no networks to manage, no strategies to refine, only time to endure. As years passed, the initial shock of confinement faded, replaced by routine acceptance. Edmond adjusted, as he always had, to the environment he occupied. Yet adaptation did not equal fulfillment. The absence of purpose weighed heavily, challenging him to find meaning within limits he had never faced before. This phase of his life was defined by stillness. The movement, coordination, and constant calculation that once consumed his days were replaced by reflection and endurance. The invisible king, once omnipresent in Washington's underworld, now existed quietly within a system designed to neutralize power. Life imprisonment did not offer redemption or resolution. It offered containment. Edmond's story did not end with dramatic closure, but with sustained silence. A man who had ruled through absence now lived in enforced presence, his freedom reduced to memory and his legacy left to be interpreted by those outside the walls. In this quiet confinement, the true cost of his choices became undeniable. Not measured in money or influence, but in time, endless, unyielding time, stretching forward without the possibility of escape. Even after a life sentence settled into routine, Rayful Edmond III's story did not fully come to rest. The systems he had once built were gone, but the knowledge he carried remained valuable. In the world of federal justice, information does not lose its relevance simply because time has passed. For Edmond, this reality opened a new chapter defined by cooperation, calculation, and controversy, a chapter that complicated any simple understanding of punishment or accountability. From the perspective of prosecutors and investigators, Edmond represented a rare asset. He was not merely a participant in Washington's drug trade, he had been an architect of it. He understood supply routes, organizational methods, financial concealment, and the psychology of disciplined criminal networks. Even behind bars, his insight could illuminate structures that extended beyond his own case, reaching into other investigations and jurisdictions. This made him, despite his conviction, a figure of continued interest. For Edmond, the decision to cooperate was neither emotional nor impulsive. It reflected the same pragmatic thinking that had guided his rise. Cooperation did not erase his sentence, but it introduced the possibility of modification, of marginal relief within an otherwise fixed future. In a system where time is the ultimate currency, even small reductions carry enormous weight. Years matter. Conditions matter. Hope, however limited, matters. The process of cooperation was slow and deliberate. It involved debriefings, statements, and verification. Authorities did not accept information at face value, they cross-checked details, tested accuracy, and measured usefulness. Edmond's credibility depended on consistency. Any exaggeration or omission risked undermining the value of his cooperation entirely. This required discipline and precision, qualities he possessed in abundance. What made this phase controversial was not merely the act of cooperation, but its implications. To many observers, the idea that someone responsible for such widespread harm could receive any form of leniency felt deeply unsettling. Communities devastated by crack addiction and violence struggled to reconcile the concept of reduced sentences with the enduring consequences of Edmond's actions. For them, cooperation appeared less like justice and more like negotiation. Law enforcement, however, viewed the situation differently. The goal was not symbolic punishment alone, but dismantling networks, preventing future harm, and gaining intelligence that could save lives. From this perspective, cooperation was a tool, not a reward. The moral discomfort it created was acknowledged, but often outweighed by practical considerations. Edmond's cooperation reportedly extended beyond his own case, offering insight into other figures and operations. This information, if accurate and actionable, had ripple effects. Investigations advanced. Charges were supported. In some instances, convictions followed. Each outcome reinforced the system's reliance on insider knowledge, even when that knowledge came from deeply compromised sources. For Edmond himself, cooperation represented a complex form of agency. In prison, options are limited. Providing information allowed him to influence outcomes again, albeit in a constrained way. It reintroduced a sense of purpose, a feeling of relevance that confinement had stripped away. Yet this agency came with costs. Within prison culture, cooperation carries stigma. Trust becomes even scarcer. Isolation deepens. The ethical tension surrounding Edmond's cooperation extended beyond public opinion. It raised questions about the nature of justice itself. Is justice measured by punishment alone, or by outcomes that reduce future harm? Can accountability coexist with utility? These questions have no simple answers, and Edmond's case became a quiet example of their complexity. The legal mechanisms governing sentence reductions added another layer of controversy. Motions based on substantial assistance are evaluated by courts, weighing the value of cooperation against the severity of the original crime. These decisions are technical, grounded in guidelines and precedent, yet their impact is deeply human. Each adjustment represents time returned, even if only partially, to someone whose actions have taken time from countless others. For those affected by Edmond's empire, these adjustments could feel like erasure of suffering. The passage of years did not dull the memory of loss. Addiction, incarceration, and death had reshaped families and neighborhoods in lasting ways. Against this backdrop, the notion of leniency felt discordant, even offensive. This emotional reality coexisted uneasily with legal pragmatism. Edmond remained largely silent publicly during this period. He did not seek to justify his actions or explain his decisions. His cooperation was procedural, not performative. This silence was consistent with his character. He had never relied on public narratives to protect himself. He relied on systems. Within prison, his role shifted subtly. He was no longer merely an inmate serving time, he was also a source of information. This status did not grant comfort or privilege. If anything, it increased his need for discretion. Visibility, once again, carried risk. He adapted accordingly, maintaining distance and limiting interactions. Over time, the immediate impact of cooperation faded into the background. Legal processes moved forward, slowly and methodically. Edmond's sentence, while possibly adjusted, remained severe. The cooperation did not restore freedom. It offered, at most, a marginal alteration of an otherwise fixed outcome. The scale of his actions ensured that consequences remained substantial. This phase of his life underscored a recurring theme in his story, the interplay between power and limitation. Even stripped of freedom, Edmond's knowledge retained value. Even within confinement, systems found ways to extract utility from his experience. Yet this utility did not equate to redemption. It did not undo harm or restore what had been lost. The controversy surrounding his cooperation also reflected broader societal discomfort with compromise in the face of injustice. It forced a confrontation with the imperfect nature of systems designed by humans, for humans. Justice, in practice, often involves trade-offs, choices between competing goods. Edmond's case made those trade-offs visible. As years passed, the urgency surrounding his cooperation diminished. New cases emerged, new figures rose and fell. Edmond's relevance became historical rather than immediate. Yet the questions his story raised remained. How should societies balance punishment and prevention? How much weight should information carry against harm? Where does accountability truly begin and end? For Edmond, this chapter did not bring closure. It added complexity. His legacy became harder to define, shaped not only by the devastation he caused, but by the information he later provided. He remained a figure of contradiction, disciplined yet destructive, invisible yet influential, punished yet still useful. In the end, cooperation did not rewrite his story. It appended to it. It revealed that even after the fall of an empire, its remnants can still exert influence, not through power, but through knowledge. And it left behind a lingering unease, reminder that in the pursuit of justice, clarity is often elusive, and resolution rarely feels complete. After Rayful Edmond III was removed from the streets, Washington did not suddenly heal. There was no clear moment when neighborhoods returned to stability or when the damage inflicted by years of crack distribution simply faded away. The fall of the Invisible King created a shift, but it was subtle and uneven. His absence altered the landscape of the drug trade, yet the wounds left behind remained deeply embedded in the city's fabric. In the immediate aftermath, law enforcement noted changes in patterns. Certain supply lines weakened, and some areas experienced temporary disruptions. Arrests decreased in places where Edmond's organization had once maintained strict order. Yet this absence did not create a vacuum of peace. It created a vacuum of control. Where disciplined systems had once enforced predictability, fragmentation took hold. Smaller groups competed, territories shifted, and violence flared unpredictably as new players sought dominance. Communities already scarred by addiction felt these changes acutely. The structured, if destructive, order that had existed under Edmond's network was replaced by instability. Drug availability did not disappear, it became less regulated, more chaotic. Users faced inconsistent supply, leading to increased desperation and risk-taking. The street economy grew more volatile, compounding existing dangers. For residents, this period was confusing. Some hoped that Edmond's removal would mark the beginning of recovery. Others quickly realized that the problem was larger than any single individual. Addiction had woven itself into daily life, and removing one supplier could not unravel years of dependency. The crisis had become systemic, sustained by demand, poverty, and limited access to support. Law enforcement faced new challenges. The centralized network they had worked so hard to dismantle was gone, replaced by multiple smaller operations that were harder to track and control. Investigations multiplied, resources stretched thinner. The clarity that had come from identifying a central figure gave way to the complexity of managing fragmentation. Success, once measured by a single conviction, now required sustained, localized efforts. The city's institutions struggled to adapt. Social services, already overwhelmed, confronted continued need with limited capacity. Treatment programs expanded slowly, often outpaced by demand. Families sought help for loved ones caught in cycles of addiction, only to encounter long waiting lists and insufficient support. The promise of recovery felt distant, unevenly distributed across neighborhoods. Economically, the impact lingered. Businesses that had closed during the height of the epidemic did not immediately return. Property values remained depressed in many areas, reflecting persistent instability. Investment favored neighborhoods with visible signs of renewal, leaving others trapped in a cycle of neglect. The uneven recovery reinforced existing inequalities, deepening divisions within the city. The psychological toll was perhaps the most enduring. Trauma does not dissipate with the removal of a single cause. Residents carried memories of loss, fear, and disruption that shaped their perceptions long after Edmond's influence ended. Trust, once broken, was slow to rebuild. Community cohesion, weakened by years of strain, required deliberate effort to restore. For younger generations, the legacy of the crack era influenced identity and opportunity. Children who grew up amid chaos entered adulthood with limited resources and lingering trauma. Their relationship with authority was shaped by years of tension and mistrust. Education and employment pathways, already fragile, were further complicated by the long shadow of the epidemic. At a broader level, Edmond's fall prompted reflection among policymakers and scholars. His case became a reference point in discussions about drug policy, law enforcement strategy, and the consequences of focusing on supply rather than demand. It highlighted the limitations of punitive approaches and the need for comprehensive solutions addressing root causes. Despite these reflections, change was slow. Structural problems do not yield easily to insight alone. Funding constraints, political priorities, and competing interests shaped responses. Progress occurred in pockets, unevenly distributed and often fragile. Some neighborhoods saw gradual improvement, while others remained trapped in cycles of instability. Edmond's absence also altered the mythology of the streets. His story became a cautionary tale, discussed quietly rather than celebrated. The Invisible King was no longer a figure of power, but of consequence. Yet even this narrative shift could not erase the realities faced by those living in the aftermath. For law enforcement, the case reinforced both the potential and the limits of targeting individual leaders. Removing Edmond disrupted a major network, but it did not resolve the underlying conditions that allowed such networks to thrive. The experience underscored the need for sustained engagement rather than singular victories. The city itself continued to evolve. New challenges emerged, new priorities took hold. Over time, the intensity of the crack crisis diminished, replaced by other concerns. Yet its imprint remained visible in demographic shifts, economic patterns, and collective memory. The scars of that era shaped how Washington understood itself and its vulnerabilities. In this context, Edmond's story became part of a larger narrative about cause and consequence. His empire had accelerated existing decline, but it did not create it. His removal altered the trajectory, but it did not guarantee recovery. The city's experience illustrated the complexity of social systems, where actions ripple outward in unpredictable ways. For those who lived through the worst years, the aftermath was not a neat conclusion, but an ongoing process. Healing occurred slowly, unevenly, often imperceptibly. Community efforts, advocacy, and resilience played crucial roles, reminding residents that recovery was possible, even if incomplete. As Washington moved forward, the memory of Rayful Edmond III receded into history, overshadowed by new stories and challenges. Yet the lessons of his rise and fall lingered. They spoke of how easily systems can exploit vulnerability, and how difficult it is to repair the damage once done. The aftermath of Edmond's empire was not defined by resolution, but by endurance. The city survived, adapted, and continued, carrying with it the weight of its past. And in that continued existence lay both the cost of the Invisible King's reign and the quiet resilience of those who lived beyond it. You've hit your limit. Please try again later. Retry. In the years following Rayful Edmond III's rise and fall, the story of his life became a blend of fact, rumor, and legend. As often happens with figures who operate largely in the shadows, the line between reality and myth became increasingly blurred. Separating the two requires careful attention to evidence, testimony, and historical context, because the popular imagination often fills gaps with exaggeration, conjecture, or moral interpretation. Understanding Edmond's story accurately demands a patient, sober look at both what he achieved and the truths that have been distorted over time. From the outset, Edmond's invisibility contributed to the mystique surrounding him. People rarely saw him in person, yet they felt his influence everywhere. In the absence of first-hand knowledge, rumors naturally proliferated. Stories of his reach, his ruthlessness, and his strategic genius circulated, each retold with slight embellishments that magnified certain qualities. The streets whispered tales of a king who could move entire neighborhoods without being seen, a figure who existed almost as an idea rather than a person. These narratives, while rooted in real achievements, often took on a life of their own, detached from the constraints of verifiable events. Media coverage also played a significant role in shaping the legend. Journalists reporting on Washington's crack epidemic highlighted dramatic statistics, sensationalized incidents, and the human toll of the drug trade. Edmond's name appeared in connection with these crises, but rarely in the careful, detailed terms that later court records would provide. The reporting, often rushed or incomplete, contributed to an image of Edmond as omnipotent, omnipresent, and almost untouchable. While these accounts captured public attention, they obscured the more methodical, strategic nature of his operation. The Invisible King became a symbol of fear and fascination rather than a subject of precise historical documentation. Over time, books, documentaries, and oral histories further amplified these myths. Each retelling introduced variations, sometimes emphasizing violence, sometimes highlighting ingenuity, often merging fact with narrative flourish. This process created a layered version of Edmond, part historical actor, part archetype of the disciplined, silent criminal mastermind. While compelling, this composite risked obscuring the truths essential for understanding the real consequences of his actions. Violence, addiction, and systemic exploitation were tangible and measurable, whereas the legends often focused on personality or strategy in isolation. Careful examination of court records, law enforcement investigations, and testimony offers a different perspective. Edmond's rise was deliberate and calculated, characterized by planning, discipline, and the strategic use of distance. He did not act impulsively, nor did he seek notoriety. His influence was significant, but it was not limitless. He operated within specific neighborhoods, managed defined supply chains, and relied on a structure that, while resilient, had inherent vulnerabilities. Understanding these constraints helps temper the larger-than-life narrative that grew around him. Separating myth from reality also requires attention to the human cost of his operation. Legends often focus on strategic brilliance or audacious leadership, but they rarely dwell on the communities affected by the trade he managed. Families were disrupted, neighborhoods destabilized, and individuals addicted or incarcerated. Recognizing these consequences grounds Edmond's story in real-world impact rather than purely symbolic achievement. The myths may entertain or fascinate, but the facts reveal the tangible scope of harm. Another element of distortion arises from comparisons to other drug figures or criminal leaders. Edmond is frequently placed alongside famous American traffickers, sometimes in ways that exaggerate his prominence or influence. While he was undoubtedly powerful within Washington and highly organized, his empire was geographically constrained and socially specific. Context matters. His operations were shaped by local conditions, including poverty, law enforcement patterns, and social networks. Misrepresenting these factors can create an inflated or misleading sense of scale. Testimony from former associates provides additional clarity. These accounts, when cross-referenced with financial records and law enforcement findings, paint a picture of someone highly disciplined but humanly fallible. Errors occurred, decisions were contested internally, and fear influenced behavior just as much as strategy. Such nuances are often lost in myth, which prefers certainty, infallibility, and simplicity. Recognizing Edmond's humanity, his judgment, his mistakes, his caution, adds depth to the story without diminishing its significance. The process of mythologizing is not inherently malicious, it is a natural human tendency. When confronted with extraordinary events or unseen forces, people construct narratives that simplify, dramatize, or moralize. Edmond's invisibility, discipline, and effectiveness made him an ideal subject for such narratives. Yet the danger lies in allowing these stories to overshadow verifiable history. Facts can be overlooked in favor of spectacle, and the lessons of reality, about systems, accountability, and social impact, can be lost. A clear-eyed approach to Edmond's story requires balancing admiration for strategic skill with acknowledgement of harm. His ability to organize, maintain discipline, and evade attention was remarkable in a technical sense. However, the consequences of those abilities were devastating for countless people. Myths that glorify power without acknowledging cost risk obscuring the ethical and societal dimensions of his actions. Over time, historians, journalists, and scholars have worked to untangle these threads. By comparing contemporary reports, court documentation, and oral histories, a more nuanced portrait emerges. Edmond was neither omnipotent nor invulnerable. He was, instead, a disciplined and calculating operator who leveraged opportunity, timing, and social networks to build a significant yet ultimately fragile empire. Recognizing this reality does not diminish the intrigue of his story, rather, it situates him in the complexity of historical and social context. The process of separating legend from fact also involves understanding how memory and storytelling function in communities affected by his rise. Oral accounts often emphasize fear, awe, and survival strategies, reflecting lived experience rather than objective analysis. These narratives, while valuable, must be read alongside verified records to understand both perception and reality. Edmond's story, like many histories, exists in these dual spaces, the lived experiences of those impacted and the broader, more abstract systems in which he operated. Ultimately, distinguishing myth from reality underscores a broader lesson: power can be both influential and limited, destructive and structured. Edmond's invisibility made him formidable, but it did not make him invincible. His strategic brilliance operated within social, economic, and legal constraints that shaped outcomes in ways both predictable and unforeseen. Recognizing the limits of myth allows us to appreciate complexity without losing sight of fact. Edmond's story also demonstrates the ways in which narratives evolve after events conclude. Over time, simplifications, exaggerations, and moral framing create enduring myths that shape public memory. Understanding this process is essential for anyone seeking to engage seriously with his life and legacy. Myths are not inherently false, but they are incomplete. Facts provide the scaffolding on which meaningful understanding is built. In the end, separating legend from truth does not diminish the power of the story, it clarifies it. Edmond's rise, his strategic discipline, his invisibility, and his eventual fall are compelling in their own right, without the need for exaggeration. Recognizing the human costs, structural dynamics, and contextual limitations enriches the narrative, creating a fuller understanding of both the man and the city he influenced. By examining the myths critically, we can see Edmond as he truly was, a disciplined, calculating figure whose influence reshaped neighborhoods, left enduring consequences, and ultimately fell under the weight of systemic and human forces beyond his control. When examining Rayful Edmond III within the broader landscape of American drug lords, it becomes clear that his story stands apart in several key ways. Comparisons to figures like Pablo Escobar in Colombia, Freeway, Rick Ross in Los Angeles, or other prominent traffickers of the 1980s reveal both similarities and crucial differences. While each operated within illicit markets, the methods, scale, and social contexts of Edmond's empire were unique. Understanding these distinctions offers insight not only into his influence but also into the factors that allowed him to rise relatively unseen in Washington, D.C. One of the most striking aspects of Edmond's career was his strategic use of invisibility. Whereas figures like Escobar built public personas, sometimes flaunting wealth, power, and influence as part of their operations, Edmond deliberately avoided exposure. He did not rely on intimidation through spectacle or media attention. His authority was exercised quietly, through a carefully maintained system of intermediaries and rules. While other drug lords gained notoriety through flamboyant displays, Edmond's approach emphasized control over recognition. This invisibility was not merely a stylistic choice, it was a survival mechanism that allowed him to operate efficiently while minimizing legal and personal risk. Another distinction lies in organizational structure. Many drug empires are hierarchical in name, but loosely controlled in practice. Violence often substitutes for management, and leadership is reinforced through fear and visibility. Edmond, by contrast, employed a form of disciplined, almost corporate organization. He established clear roles for his lieutenants, compartmentalized operations to reduce exposure, and enforced rules consistently. This system reduced internal conflict, increased efficiency, and insulated him from direct involvement in daily transactions. While other traffickers relied heavily on personal charisma or public dominance, Edmond's authority emerged organically from the structure he designed. This difference highlights a sophisticated understanding of human behavior, risk management, and operational strategy. Geography also played a defining role. Edmond's empire was concentrated within Washington, D.C., a city with unique social, political, and economic characteristics. Unlike traffickers operating in larger metropolitan areas or internationally connected networks, Edmond's influence was intense but geographically focused. This localization allowed him to manage his operation more tightly, fostering loyalty and stability within the network. It also meant that while his empire was enormous within the context of Washington, its reach did not rival global trafficking networks. Understanding the significance of scale and context is essential. Edmond's power was not universal, but within his domain, it was virtually absolute. Timing further differentiates Edmond from other figures. He rose during the early years of the crack epidemic, recognizing both the profitability and the social vulnerability inherent in Washington's neighborhoods. This early entry provided a first-mover advantage. While others responded to emerging markets opportunistically, Edmond positioned himself to dominate through preparation, patience, and observation. His ability to anticipate market growth and structure operations accordingly illustrates a level of strategic foresight that distinguishes him from many contemporaries who achieved rapid gains but were often undone by visibility, impulsiveness, or lack of planning. Comparisons with other American drug figures also reveal differences in risk tolerance and personal behavior. Many traffickers engaged directly in violence or public intimidation, using these tactics to assert control. Edmond, by contrast, treated violence as a last resort, preferring negotiation and subtle enforcement. He avoided unnecessary attention, recognizing that exposure increased vulnerability. His risk management extended to financial dealings, communication methods, and personal conduct. In this sense, Edmond's leadership was defined less by aggression and more by precision. The contrast highlights a distinctive approach to power. Influence can be maintained quietly, through systems and discipline rather than spectacle and fear. Social and economic contexts further distinguish Edmond. His operation thrived in neighborhoods shaped by poverty, neglect, and systemic inequities. These conditions created both vulnerability and opportunity. Edmond exploited them strategically, building an organization that responded to local demand with remarkable efficiency. Unlike traffickers operating in wealthier or more globally connected markets, he navigated densely interconnected, socially complex urban environments. Success required understanding not only supply and demand, but also the subtle dynamics of trust, loyalty, and community perception. This social acuity is a defining feature of his empire, one that often gets lost when comparisons focus solely on financial or violent metrics. Yet despite these differences, there are parallels to other drug lords in terms of impact and consequence. Like many figures before and after him, Edmond's activities contributed to widespread addiction, family disruption, and community destabilization. The human cost of his empire resonates similarly to that of traffickers in Los Angeles, Miami, or Medellin. While methods, style, and scale may vary, the fundamental consequences of organized drug distribution are tragically consistent across contexts. Law enforcement response also illustrates contrasts. National attention on figures like Escobar involved cross-border operations, military engagement, and international coordination. Edmond, operating domestically and quietly, initially escaped this level of scrutiny. His invisibility delayed intervention, allowing his network to reach its peak before concentrated federal efforts took effect. This difference underscores how methodology and operational secrecy can alter the trajectory of criminal enterprises, even within the same era of heightened policing and media attention. Rayful Edmond III's story, when examined from a distance, offers lessons that extend far beyond the particulars of his empire or the streets of Washington. His rise, operation, and eventual fall provide insights into the nature of power, control, and human behavior, illustrating patterns that are both timeless and context-specific. The most important lessons, however, are subtle, requiring careful reflection and a willingness to look beyond surface events to the systems, decisions, and consequences that shape them. One of the first lessons is the role of discipline in shaping outcomes. Edmond's success did not stem from brute force alone, nor from charisma, nor from luck. It emerged from a combination of careful observation, strategic patience, and the consistent application of rules within his network. He understood that small, incremental decisions, repeated over time, could build immense influence. In other words, power was not a momentary surge but a sustained accumulation. The ability to remain calm, focused, and methodical allowed him to navigate risk, avoid exposure, and maintain control in an environment where impulsive actions often led to ruin. Closely related to this is the lesson of invisibility. Edmond's choice to remain unseen, to operate quietly through intermediaries and structure rather than spectacle, demonstrates that influence does not always require recognition. Visibility can amplify risk, invite scrutiny, and provoke retaliation. Conversely, absence can serve as a form of protection. This lesson extends beyond criminal contexts. In business, politics, and social systems, there are situations where impact is maximized not by overt display, but by measured, deliberate action behind the scenes. Edmond's life illustrates how strategic discretion can be as powerful as public dominance. Another key takeaway concerns the human element in any system. No matter how sophisticated, disciplined, or efficient an organization becomes, its strength ultimately depends on the people within it. Edmond's empire was vulnerable not because of law enforcement tactics alone, but because human behavior is inherently unpredictable. Fear, self-interest, and external pressure can erode loyalty, introduce error, and destabilize even the most well-organized structure. This is a lesson in humility. Systems can extend influence, but they cannot fully eliminate human variability. Leadership requires both the design of structure and the management of individuals, and even the most careful strategies must account for human imperfection. The consequences of influence and decision-making also stand out as a central lesson. Edmond's operation, while disciplined and efficient, had profound effects on communities. Addiction, violence, family disruption, and social decay were all direct or indirect outcomes of the empire he built. The lesson here is the duality of impact. Actions that create power for one party often carry consequences for many others. Ethical reflection, foresight, and awareness of ripple effects are essential when wielding influence in any context, legal or otherwise. Edmond's story underscores that effectiveness cannot be measured solely by success or control. It must also be evaluated in terms of broader human cost. Timing and adaptability emerge as additional lessons. Edmond rose at a moment when the crack epidemic intersected with social and economic conditions that he could navigate strategically. Recognizing opportunity requires not only awareness but also the patience to act at the right moment. Similarly, adapting to changing circumstances, shifts in law enforcement, market conditions, or internal dynamics, was critical to sustaining his influence. This flexibility, combined with disciplined control, allowed him to maintain operations longer than many contemporaries. The broader lesson is that strategy is dynamic. Success depends not only on initial insight but also on the ability to adjust continuously to evolving circumstances. Another insight concerns the limitations of power. Edmond, despite his reach and organizational skill, was ultimately vulnerable. Systems can delay consequences, but they cannot eliminate them entirely. Law enforcement, betrayals from within, and the eventual collapse of networks demonstrate that no matter how disciplined or unseen, human endeavors have boundaries. This serves as a cautionary reflection on hubris and the impermanence of influence. Even the most carefully constructed systems are subject to forces beyond control, legal, social, or personal. Awareness of these limits is a form of wisdom in any field of human endeavor. Edmond's story also emphasizes the interplay between environment and opportunity. His rise was facilitated not only by personal skill but also by structural conditions in Washington: poverty, unemployment, inadequate social services, and political neglect. Recognizing how systemic factors create openings for influence is critical. Individual action is shaped and constrained by context, and understanding these constraints can inform both strategy and prevention. For society, this highlights that addressing systemic vulnerabilities, through education, opportunity, and support, can mitigate the conditions that allow destructive systems to thrive. Another subtle lesson lies in ethical and moral ambiguity. Edmond operated in a space defined by legality, loyalty, and survival. His choices cannot be understood simply as right or wrong in abstract terms; they were informed by circumstance, perceived necessity, and risk assessment. Reflecting on this ambiguity teaches caution against oversimplified judgments in complex systems. Human behavior is rarely purely moral or immoral; it is shaped by constraints, incentives, and perception. Edmond's story invites consideration of nuance, encouraging deeper analysis of cause, effect, and responsibility. Resilience emerges as a final, essential lesson. Despite constant risk, surveillance, and internal pressures, Edmond maintained operations and influence for years. His ability to survive within hostile and unpredictable conditions demonstrates the power of focus, planning, and psychological endurance. Resilience, in this sense, is not mere stubbornness but an active, disciplined management of risk, resources, and perception. It is a lesson applicable to both personal and professional domains. Endurance and adaptability amplify the effectiveness of strategy, even in adverse environments. Taken together, these lessons form a coherent narrative about power, influence, and consequence. Discipline, discretion, human unpredictability, timing, adaptability, ethical awareness, and resilience are all central to understanding not just Edmond's life, but broader patterns of leadership and control. His story functions as both a cautionary tale and a case study. It reveals how influence can be constructed quietly, sustained carefully, and ultimately challenged by forces beyond any single individual's control. Edmond's narrative also invites reflection on societal responsibility. Individual skill and strategy are inseparable from context. Communities, institutions, and systems shape the possibilities for both opportunity and harm. Recognizing the interplay between personal agency and structural conditions can inform policy, education, and prevention strategies. It is a reminder that understanding power requires attention to both individual choices and the environments in which they occur. Ultimately, the lessons embedded in Edmond's life are about awareness, responsibility, and foresight. They remind us that influence carries weight, that systems depend on both design and human behavior, and that success without reflection can create lasting consequences. His story, while situated in the streets of Washington and the specific dynamics of the crack epidemic, speaks to universal principles of power, control, and ethical consideration. In studying it carefully, one sees not only the trajectory of a single individual, but the broader truths about how systems operate, how influence endures, and how the cost of human action reverberates far beyond its origin. In the quiet aftermath of Rayful Edmond III's rise and fall, Washington, D.C., continued to breathe under the weight of a history both lived and remembered. The city's streets, once ruled by invisible networks and silent authority, carried echoes of choices made years before, choices that had shaped neighborhoods, families, and entire generations. The story of Edmond's empire, its meticulous construction, and its eventual collapse is not merely one of crime or punishment. It is a meditation on the nature of power, the impermanence of influence, and the ways in which human systems, no matter how disciplined, are ultimately vulnerable to time, chance, and human frailty. When we consider the life and legacy of Edmond, it is essential to return to the principle that defined his existence: invisibility. From the earliest stages of his criminal enterprise, Edmond understood the protective power of remaining unseen. Unlike many contemporaries whose flamboyance and audacity invited both admiration and danger, Edmond moved quietly, deliberately, leaving few traces in public spaces. He avoided the limelight, relied on intermediaries, and insulated himself from day-to-day operations while maintaining absolute influence over outcomes. In this way, he created a system that thrived on structure and discretion, achieving control without drawing attention. This method was effective, almost surgical, and it allowed him to operate at the apex of Washington's drug economy without immediate interference. Yet invisibility, no matter how well maintained, is not eternal. The same qualities that protected Edmond during his rise also delayed but did not prevent his eventual exposure. The fall of Edmond's empire, while inevitable in hindsight, was gradual and complex. Law enforcement efforts, though initially reactive, became more focused as patterns emerged. Investigators, armed with informants, wiretaps, and financial analysis, slowly mapped the architecture of his organization. Each piece of evidence added clarity, revealing the structure that Edmond had so carefully concealed. Even as arrests and investigations mounted, the empire continued to function, its resilience a testament to the discipline Edmond had instilled. But the cracks began to appear, not in overt violence or dramatic confrontations, but in the small failures and betrayals that no system can entirely prevent. Human behavior, unpredictable and often self-serving, eroded the stability of the network from within, illustrating one of the most enduring truths of his story: no matter how sophisticated the design, all systems are ultimately dependent on the people who operate them. As the judicial process unfolded, Edmond's invisibility was stripped away. Trials, testimonies, and evidence brought to light the extent of his influence, converting whispers into documented fact. The courtroom did not provide spectacle, it offered a measured, methodical translation of years of operation into legal terms. Testimonies described distribution networks, financial management, and operational discipline, painting a portrait of an individual who exercised remarkable control through organization and foresight. Yet alongside these factual accounts, the human toll became undeniable. Families had been fractured, neighborhoods destabilized, and lives altered irrevocably. This juxtaposition of strategic brilliance and human devastation is central to understanding Edmond's legacy, a man capable of extraordinary planning and discipline, whose decisions carried consequences far beyond the scope of his personal ambition. Confinement, following conviction, marked a profound shift in Edmond's existence. The transition from citywide influence to life behind bars forced a confrontation with permanence, limitation, and time. Within the controlled environment of incarceration, power was redefined. The systems he had relied upon no longer mattered, influence became internal, exercised through observation, discipline, and adaptation. This period highlights an essential aspect of his story: even the most effective networks cannot insulate an individual from the consequences of structural and legal forces. Edmond's empire could persist for a time, but his personal autonomy could not. Yet even in confinement, Edmond's story did not end. His knowledge, cultivated over years of meticulous organization, remained a resource. Cooperation with authorities, motivated by both pragmatism and opportunity, introduced ethical and practical complexity. By providing insight into remaining networks and operations, Edmond contributed to law enforcement efforts to dismantle ongoing criminal activity. This cooperation, while controversial, illustrates the nuanced interplay between punishment, utility, and human decision-making. It underscores the broader lesson that influence extends beyond the immediate exercise of power. Knowledge and strategic insight are forms of currency that persist even when traditional authority is removed. The aftermath of Edmond's removal from the streets offers further reflection on the consequences of systemic disruption. While his organization ceased to dominate, the underlying conditions that had facilitated its rise, poverty, social inequality, and inadequate institutional support, remained. Neighborhoods continued to grapple with the residual effects of addiction, instability, and disrupted community structures. The city had changed, but the imprint of the empire lingered, visible in both material and psychological ways. The lesson here is profound. Individual actors can accelerate or amplify systemic dysfunction, but they rarely create it from nothing. Addressing the legacy of such influence requires more than punitive measures. It necessitates structural investment, social programs, and community resilience. Another dimension of Edmond's legacy is the interplay between myth and reality. Because of his invisibility and strategic discretion, narratives about his life became amplified, distorted, and sometimes romanticized. Stories circulated portraying him as omnipotent or infallible, emphasizing daring or audacity over methodical calculation. Separating myth from historical reality is crucial for understanding the true lessons of his life. Edmond's brilliance was real, but it operated within constraints, and it carried costs that myths often obscure. Recognizing the distinction between narrative embellishment and factual record allows for a sober analysis of both his achievements and the consequences they wrought. His story also underscores the delicate balance between individual agency and structural context. Edmond's rise was facilitated by social and economic conditions. Systemic neglect, poverty, and a city grappling with inequality created openings that a disciplined, strategic actor could exploit. While personal skill and decision-making were central, they were inseparable from environment. This interplay emphasizes a broader principle: influence is most potent when individual capacity intersects with systemic vulnerability. For societies seeking to prevent similar dynamics, addressing root conditions, through education, economic opportunity, and community support, is as important as enforcing legal consequences. Reflecting on Edmond's life also provides insight into leadership and human behavior. His authority derived not from fear alone but from consistency, reliability, and strategic planning. He cultivated trust selectively, enforced rules predictably, and compartmentalized information to maintain control. These traits, applied in legal or organizational contexts, can illustrate principles of effective leadership. Yet his example also demonstrates the ethical dimension of influence. Leadership exercised without regard for broader consequences can produce immense harm. Edmond's story is thus both a lesson in strategic thinking and a cautionary tale about moral responsibility. Time, both during his rise and after his fall, is another key element in understanding his legacy. His empire expanded gradually, built on small, consistent decisions rather than sudden, impulsive moves. Its dismantling was similarly measured, reflecting the deliberate pace of law enforcement and judicial processes. Time amplified both his influence and the consequences of his actions. The slow accumulation of power and the slow unraveling of networks illustrate that significant systems rarely emerge or collapse instantaneously. They are processes that unfold, shaped by repeated choices, environmental pressures, and human behavior. Edmond's story is also instructive in understanding resilience and adaptation. During his ascent, he navigated a volatile environment with careful observation and strategic adjustments. Even under pressure from law enforcement or internal challenges, he adapted without panic. This resilience, applied over years, allowed him to sustain influence longer than many of his contemporaries. Yet it also had limits. No system, no matter how well structured, can indefinitely counteract both external enforcement and internal human variability. Recognizing these limits is essential in understanding both his success and eventual downfall. In the broader historical and social context, Edmond's life highlights the complexity of cause and consequence. The crack epidemic, social inequities, and law enforcement responses all intersected with his personal strategy to produce outcomes that were simultaneously predictable and tragic. His individual choices were decisive within his sphere of control, but they operated within larger systemic forces that both constrained and enabled them. This perspective encourages a nuanced view of history. Events are shaped by individual agency, but that agency is always exercised within a broader structural and temporal framework. Ultimately, reflecting on Rayful Edmond III's story is an exercise in understanding human systems, ethical responsibility, and societal consequence. His rise demonstrates how discipline, strategic thinking, and careful management of visibility can produce influence even in hostile or highly monitored environments. His fall, conversely, illustrates the limits of power, the inevitability of consequence, and the enduring impact of human decisions on communities and institutions. The narrative, viewed as a whole, is not merely a criminal biography, it is a study in the interplay of ambition, structure, morality, and the human cost of influence. As the years have passed since his removal from the streets, Edmond has become both a historical figure and a cautionary example. His empire, though dismantled, continues to inform discussions about law enforcement strategy, social policy, and the ethics of influence. The communities shaped by his actions reflect both the harm he caused and the resilience of those who endured. His story remains a reminder that power, no matter how carefully constructed, is always conditional, always subject to human unpredictability, and always inseparable from the broader systems in which it operates. In the quiet streets of Washington, the memory of Edmond's reign persists not as a tale of glamour, but as a meditation on control, consequence, and legacy. Neighborhoods, families, and systems still carry the echoes of the decisions made under his influence. The Invisible King's story fades from immediate relevance but persists in structural, psychological, and historical terms. It is a reminder that human actions ripple far beyond the moment, shaping lives, communities, and institutions in ways that endure long after the individual is gone. Reflecting on his life as a whole, the lessons are manifold. Discipline and patience build power, invisibility can protect influence, human behavior defines the limits of systems, decisions carry consequences beyond immediate perception, and no empire, however carefully constructed, is immune to time, scrutiny, and internal fragility. Edmond's life, rise, operation, and fall encapsulate these principles with clarity, offering both caution and insight. His story, woven into the broader tapestry of Washington's history, is a testament to the interplay of strategy, environment, and consequence, leaving a legacy that continues to inform, caution, and resonate. In the final analysis, Rayful Edmond III was neither a myth nor merely a statistic. He was a human being whose choices, discipline, and strategy shaped a significant chapter in the city's history. The Invisible King may have faded from the streets, but the lessons of his life remain vivid, enduring in the structures he built, the consequences he left behind, and the stories that continue to be told. His legacy is not one of triumph in the conventional sense, nor of redemption, but of reflection, a case study in the complexity of influence, the fragility of power, and the profound, lasting effects of human action. It is a story that continues to teach, caution, and compel understanding, inviting each listener to consider the delicate balance between control and consequence, strategy and morality, visibility and invisibility, in a world defined as much by human choice as by circumstance.